A millionaire was crying because he had no children, until two hungry twins knocked on his door. He was shocked when he saw the boys looked exactly like him. Before we dive in, tell me where you're watching from. It always makes my day to read your comments. The wind howled through the trees in the wealthy neighborhood of Westbrook, sending autumn leaves dancing across manicured lawns. 6-year-old twins Mason and Miles Parker walked hand in hand down streets they had never visited before, their worn clothes and scuffed sneakers marking them as strangers in this land of luxury. "Are you sure about this?" Miles whispered, his blue eyes wide with uncertainty as he clutched his brother's hand tighter. Mason nodded, his identical blue eyes reflecting a determination beyond his years. "Mom needs help. She hasn't eaten in 3 days so we could have the last of the bread." The memory of their mother, Catherine, lying pale and weak on her bed, refusing food so they could eat, strengthened their resolve. They had watched her growing, weaker each day, her once vibrant face now hollow with fever. This one, Mason decided, stopping before the largest mansion they had seen yet, wrought iron gates partially open, revealing a sprawling estate with windows that glowed amber against the darkening sky. Inside that mansion, Edward Blackwood sat alone in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched before him. At 42, he had amassed a fortune in real estate that most men could only dream of, yet the emptiness inside him grew with each passing year. 2 years ago, he had lost Claire, his beloved wife, after years of failed attempts to have children. The nursery upstairs remained closed, a shrine to dreams that never materialized. The doorbell's chime echoed through the silent house, startling Edward from his thoughts. Richards, his loyal butler of 15 years, appeared at the study door. "Sir, there are children at the door," Edward frowned. "Children?" Curiosity drew him to the massive front entrance. When he opened the door, the sight before him froze him in place. 2 small boys with identical faces looked up at him, their eyes, the same startling blue as his own, wide with a mixture of fear and hope. "Excuse me, sir," the slightly taller one said, his voice trembling but determined. "Could you spare some food? Our mom is sick, and we haven't eaten since yesterday." Something stirred in Edward's chest as he looked at these children, a recognition so profound it stole his breath. It wasn't just their eyes. It was the shape of their faces, the set of their jaws, the way the braver one stood slightly forward to protect his brother. "Of course," Edward heard himself say, his voice distant to his own ears. "Please come in." As the boys stepped inside, Richards observed his employer with astonishment. In 2 years, Edward Blackwood had not invited a single soul into his home. Yet here he was, ushering in 2 ragged children as if they were expected guests. Edward couldn't explain the pull he felt toward these boys, but as he closed the door behind them, something long dormant within him began to awaken. The emptiness that had been his constant companion suddenly seemed a little less absolute. Edward Blackwood's immense wealth was evident in every corner of his mansion, from the hand-carved mahogany staircase to the original paintings that adorned the walls. Yet as he led the twins through the grand entrance hall, the hollow echo of their footsteps revealed what money couldn't buy: warmth, laughter, life. "Richards, please ask Mrs. Peterson to prepare something for our guests," Edward instructed his butler, who nodded with barely concealed surprise. "Right away, sir." As Richards disappeared toward the kitchen, Edward guided Mason and Miles to an elegant sitting room. The boys perched uncomfortably on the edge of a velvet sofa, their small frames dwarfed by the opulent furniture. "Your home is really big," Mason observed, his eyes darting around the room. "Like a castle," Miles added in a whisper. Edward smiled faintly. "It feels too big most days." The admission surprised him. He rarely shared personal feelings, even with Richards or Mrs. Peterson, who had served him for 15 years. The East Coast's most successful real estate mogul, Edward had built Blackwood Properties from a modest inheritance into an empire that dominated skylines from Boston to Miami. Business publications called him brilliant, ruthless, visionary. None mentioned lonely. "Do you live here all by yourself?" Mason asked with a child's directness. Edward nodded. Just me and my staff. My wife. She passed away 2 years ago. Our grandma died last year. Miles offered softly. Mom says she's watching over us from heaven now. Edward studied the boys more carefully. The resemblance that had struck him at the door was even more pronounced now. The shape of their eyes, the angle of their chins, even the way Mason's left eyebrow arched slightly when he spoke. It was like looking at photographs of himself as a child. You mentioned your mother is ill? Edward prompted gently. Mason nodded, his expression growing serious. She works all the time, but then she got really sick. She can hardly get out of bed now. She keeps saying she's fine, but she's not. Miles added, his small voice thick with worry. She gave us her food for 3 days. Edward felt something twist inside him, empathy certainly, but also a strange, protective instinct he hadn't experienced before. Richards returned, announcing that dinner would be ready shortly. Edward excused himself and followed his butler into the hallway. Richards, there's something about these boys. I noticed it immediately, sir. The butler replied quietly. The resemblance is rather striking. Through the doorway, Edward observed the twins. Miles had discovered a chess set on a side table and was carefully examining a knight, while Mason stood protectively nearby. The scene stirred something in Edward, memories of a closed door upstairs, of a room prepared with such hope now gathering dust. Since Claire's death, Edward had retreated into his work, his home becoming more mausoleum than residence. Each room held ghostly imprints of the life they'd planned together. The nursery with its untouched crib, the library with children's books Claire had collected, the garden where she'd envisioned their children playing. 3 miscarriages had devastated them both, each loss deepening Claire's depression. When she was finally diagnosed with cancer, it seemed a cruel joke of fate. She had fought bravely, but in the end Edward was left alone with nothing but his wealth and the hollow shell of their dreams. Mrs. Peterson appeared, a grandmotherly woman with kind eyes and efficient movements. Dinner is ready, Mr. Blackwood. I've prepared something simple the children might enjoy. In the formal dining room, Mrs. Peterson had thoughtfully set places at one end of the massive table, rather than stretching them across its intimidating length. The twins' eyes widened at the spread before them. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh vegetables, and warm rolls. Please eat as much as you'd like, Edward encouraged. Though clearly starving, the boys used their forks and napkins properly, taking measured bites rather than wolfing down the food. Your mother taught you good manners, Edward observed. Mason nodded proudly. Mom says manners don't cost anything, so even if we don't have much, we can still have those. She used to work in a fancy office before we were born, Miles added, between careful bites. She knows all the proper forks and stuff. Edward's hand paused midway to his water glass. Where did your mother work? Different places. Mason shrugged. She works at the grocery store now and cleans houses and sometimes answers phones at night. But she went to college, Miles said. She has a diploma on our wall. What's your mother's name? Edward asked, his voice carefully neutral. Catherine Parker, Mason answered. The name hit Edward like a physical blow. Jennifer Catherine Parker, his former secretary, with whom he'd had a brief relationship 7 years ago before meeting Claire. The timelines aligned perfectly. The boys were 6. The resemblance wasn't coincidence. As the realization dawned, Edward felt the ground shifting beneath him. These weren't just hungry children who'd appeared at his door by chance. These were his sons. The kitchen of the Blackwood mansion gleamed with polished copper and marble surfaces. Mason and Miles sat at the breakfast nook, tension in their small shoulders despite the welcoming atmosphere Mrs. Peterson had created. Would you boys like some dessert? The housekeeper asked, already pulling a freshly baked apple pie from the warming drawer. Miles looked to Mason, seeking permission from his more decisive twin. Mason nodded eagerly but remembered his manners. Yes, please, ma'am, he replied. Edward observed from the doorway, struck by how the boys maintained dignity despite their obvious hunger. The way Miles deferred to Mason, the slight protective, shift of Mason's body toward his brother. These were patterns he recognized from his own childhood with his younger brother. "Your mother must be very worried about you," Edward said, joining them at the table as Mrs. Peterson served generous slices of pie topped with vanilla ice cream. "We left a note," Mason explained, eyes fixed on the steam rising from his pie. "We said we were getting help." "She's been so sick," Miles added, his voice small. "Yesterday she couldn't even stand up to make us breakfast. She keeps saying she'll be fine tomorrow," Mason continued. "But she says that every day and she keeps getting worse." Mrs. Peterson exchanged a worried glance with Edward. A single mother, seriously ill, with 2 young boys to care for. The situation was dire. "What happened to your apartment?" Edward asked gently. "Did you lose it when your mother couldn't work?" The twins exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. "We still have it," Mason explained. "But the heat got turned off last week. Mom wrapped us in all the blankets." "And there's no more food," Miles added. "The neighbor lady brought soup 2 days ago, but that's gone now." Edward felt a knot form in his stomach. Children should never bear such burdens. "When you've finished eating, would you like to take some food home for your mother?" he offered. Their faces lit up with hope. "Can we really?" Miles asked, blue eyes wide. Mrs. Peterson was already gathering containers. "I'll pack enough for several days," she assured them. As the boys finished their dessert, Edward questioned them further, gathering pieces of a puzzle he was only beginning to understand. "Your full name is Parker?" he asked casually. "Catherine Parker?" "Yes, sir," Mason replied. "Catherine Jennifer Parker is Mom's whole name, but everybody calls her Catherine." Jennifer. Edward's suspicions solidified into certainty. Jennifer, Catherine Parker, had been her full name. She had gone by Jennifer at work. The timing aligned perfectly with their brief relationship 7 years ago, just before he'd met Claire. "Do you know your father's name?" The question slipped out before Edward could stop himself. The kitchen grew quiet. Miles looked down at his empty plate. "Mom has a picture of him," Mason finally said. "But she doesn't talk about him much, just that he was too busy for a family." The knife of guilt twisted deeper. Had Jennifer tried to tell him? Had she believed he'd rejected his own children? "We should get back to Mom," Mason said, sliding off his chair. "She'll worry if we're gone too long." Mrs. Peterson had filled a large basket with containers of food, adding fruit, bread, and cookies. "This should help for a while," she said kindly. Edward made a swift decision. "Let me drive you home. It's getting dark and that basket will be heavy." As he led the boys to his car, Edward's mind raced. These children, his sons, had been living in poverty while he dwelled in empty luxury. 7 years of fatherhood lost. 7 years he could never reclaim. Whatever had happened between him and Jennifer in the past, one thing was certain. Everything in Edward Blackwood's carefully ordered life was about to change forever. Sleep eluded Edward that night. His spacious bedroom with its custom king-sized mattress and Egyptian cotton sheets offered no comfort as memories and questions churned through his mind. At 3 a.m., he abandoned all pretense of rest and made his way to his home office. The large mahogany desk held meticulous records of his life, both personal and professional. He unlocked a filing cabinet that contained employee records from years past. "Parker, Jennifer K.," he murmured, fingers finding the folder with practiced efficiency. The file contained standard employment documentation, performance reviews, all excellent, and a small envelope he'd never opened, her resignation letter. He'd been too hurt by her sudden departure to read it at the time, having believed they had a connection beyond the professional. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Edward, I am resigning effective immediately for personal reasons. I appreciated the opportunity to work at Blackwood Properties. Jennifer Parker. No explanation, no forwarding address, nothing about a pregnancy." Edward closed his eyes, remembering. Their brief relationship had been intense but discreet. Company policy discouraged such entanglements. Then he'd met Claire at a charity gala, and the connection had been instantaneous. He'd ended things with Jennifer as gently as possible. 2 weeks later, she'd resigned. Had she already known she was pregnant? Had she tried to tell him? He opened his laptop and searched social media for Catherine Jennifer Parker. Nothing current appeared. Next, he pulled public records, finding an address in the poorest section of Westbrook, a stark contrast to his affluent neighborhood just miles away. The more Edward dug, the more his guilt mounted. Employment records showed Jennifer, now Catherine, working. Multiple minimum wage jobs simultaneously. No marriage certificate. No partner to help with the children. His sons had been living in poverty while he donated millions to charitable causes. Dawn was breaking when a soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Richard stood at the door, impeccably dressed despite the early hour. "Sir, the boys have returned." Edward hurried downstairs to find Mason and Miles in the foyer, their breath creating small clouds in the cold morning air. "Mom ate some soup and toast," Mason reported, his small face serious. "She said we shouldn't bother people, but we wanted to say thank you for the food." Edward knelt to their level. "You're not bothering me at all. I'm glad your mother ate something. Is she feeling any better?" The twins exchanged glances. "She's still coughing a lot," Miles said worriedly. "And her forehead is really hot." Edward made a swift decision. "I have a friend who's a doctor. Would you allow him to check on your mother? As a favor to me?" The twins hesitated. "We don't have money for doctors," Mason said quietly. "Mom says hospitals ask too many questions." "This won't cost anything," Edward assured them. "And no questions, I promise. Just someone to help your mother feel better." An hour later, Dr. Harris, who had attended Claire during her illness, was examining Catherine in her small apartment, while Edward waited with the twins in their tiny living room. The space was clean but sparse. A worn sofa, a small television, a bookshelf overflowing with library books. A diploma from State University hung on the wall beside school photos of the boys. Dr. Harris emerged from the bedroom with a grave expression. "Severe pneumonia," he said quietly to Edward. "She needs hospitalization immediately. Her oxygen levels are dangerously low." Edward glanced at the worried faces of his sons and made another life-changing decision. "Make the arrangements," he told Dr. Harris. "The best private room, everything she needs. I'll cover all expenses." As an ambulance was called, Edward watched the twins gathering their mother's things. A robe, slippers, a hairbrush. The efficiency with which these small children handled crisis spoke volumes about the challenges they'd already faced in their young lives. He vowed then that whatever complications lay ahead, Mason and Miles would never again face such hardships alone. Victor Reynolds's Bentley screeched to a halt in the circular driveway of the Blackwood estate, sending gravel spraying. At 62, with silver hair and ruthless intelligence, Victor had been Edward's attorney and closest confidant for over 20 years. The man who had guided Blackwood Properties through its most aggressive expansions and messiest lawsuits. Today, he stormed into the mansion unannounced, briefcase clutched in a white-knuckled grip. "Where is he?" Victor demanded of Richards. "Mr. Blackwood is on the terrace, sir," the butler replied with practiced neutrality. "Shall I announce you?" "Don't bother," Victor growled, striding through the house with familiar authority. He found Edward sitting on the stone terrace, watching two small boys playing an improvised game of tag around the garden fountain. For a moment, Victor stood unnoticed, absorbing the scene with growing alarm. Edward Blackwood, the ruthless real estate magnate who'd spent the last 2 years as a recluse, smiling faintly as he observed children running across his immaculate lawn. "Have you completely lost your mind?" Victor's voice cut through the peaceful scene. Edward turned, unsurprised. "I was wondering when you'd show up." "Richards called my office in a panic," Victor hissed, keeping his voice low enough that the children couldn't hear. "Something about you taking in street urchins and rushing a woman to the hospital? The tabloids are already sniffing around." Edward remained calm. "They're not street urchins, Victor. They're my sons." Victor's face flushed red. "You're—" He stopped, himself glancing at the boys, then grabbed Edward's arm. "Inside now." In Edward's study, Victor paced like a caged tiger. "This has scam written all over it. Some woman claims her kids are yours and you just believe her. No DNA test, no legal consultation, you of all people? Catherine hasn't claimed anything, Edward corrected. She doesn't even know I suspect the truth. And look at them, Victor. You've known me since I was a child. Can you honestly say you don't see it? Victor waved dismissively. Children can be coached. Makeup can create resemblances. Do you know how many long-lost children have tried to claim pieces of fortunes like yours? These boys showed up hungry at my door. They didn't ask for money. Yet, Victor snapped. This is how these schemes start. First the sympathy play, then the reveal, then the demands, and you've skipped straight to installing them in your home. Edward's jaw tightened. Their mother is seriously ill with pneumonia. What would you have me do? Send them to foster care? Victor leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper. Think about your reputation, the company's stock. What happens when the press discovers that the most eligible bachelor in Westbrook has illegitimate twins with a former secretary? Every gold digger from here to California will come forward with similar claims. Doubt flickered across Edward's face. Victor pressed his advantage. If she is who you think she is, why didn't she tell you 7 years ago? Why live in poverty if she could have secured child support from a millionaire? It doesn't add up, Edward. At Westbrook Memorial Hospital, Catherine Parker drifted in and out of consciousness, the antibiotics and oxygen slowly helping her lungs fight the infection. In a rare moment of clarity, she asked the nurse where her sons were. They're safe, honey, the nurse assured her. A Mr. Blackwood has been looking after them while you recover. Catherine's fever-bright eyes widened in panic. Blackwood? Edward Blackwood? When the nurse nodded, Catherine tried to sit up, setting off a violent coughing fit. You don't understand, she gasped between coughs. He can't have my boys. He didn't want them before. He doesn't get them now. The nurse gently eased her back against the pillows. Save your strength, Miss Parker. Whatever it is, you can sort it out when you're better. Catherine turned her face to the wall, tears slipping silently down her flushed cheeks. For 6 years, she had protected her sons from the man who had chosen career and convenience over his own children. She had never told them their father had known about them and chosen to send money rather than love. Had never shared how she'd refused his cold financial offer, determined to raise her boys with dignity rather than charity. Now, through some cruel twist of fate, Mason and Miles were in Edward Blackwood's mansion, experiencing the wealth and privilege that could have been theirs all along, while she lay helpless, unable to shield them from the inevitable disappointment when he tired of playing father. Despite Victor's warnings, Edward couldn't bring himself to send the twins away while their mother recovered. The mansion that had felt cavernous and empty for years gradually filled with the sounds of small footsteps and occasional laughter. Mrs. Peterson observed the changes with quiet satisfaction. For the first time since Claire's death, lights burned in rooms that had remained dark and meals were served with conversation rather than silence. On the third morning, Edward found Miles sitting cross-legged on the library floor, surrounded by books about stars and planets. You like astronomy? Edward asked, sitting beside him. Miles nodded shyly. I want to be an astronaut someday. Or maybe a scientist who studies black holes. I wanted to be an astronaut too when I was your age, Edward admitted. I had glow-in-the-dark stars all over my ceiling. Miles looked up with newfound interest. Really? Mom couldn't let us put stars on our ceiling because the landlord would get mad. Without thinking, Edward reached for a heavy astronomy atlas on a high shelf. This was my favorite book when I was a boy. It shows all the constellations. Miles strained to see the detailed illustrations, and Edward instinctively lifted the child onto his shoulders. The simple act, something fathers did with sons every day, felt momentous. For a heartbeat, the weight of the small body on his shoulders made Edward's chest tighten with emotion. I can see everything from up here, Miles exclaimed, his small hands steadying himself on Edward's head. Meanwhile, Mason had discovered the chess set in the study. Edward found him carefully, arranging the pieces, his face scrunched in concentration. Do you play? Edward asked. No, sir, Mason replied. But I've seen people play in the park. The horse pieces are my favorite. They're called knights, Edward explained, sitting across from him. Would you like to learn? Mason's face lit up. Could you teach me? I'm good at learning games. As Edward explained the basic moves, he was struck by how quickly Mason grasped the concepts. By their third game, the boy was thinking 2 moves ahead, his strategic mind reminding Edward of himself. As a child, you're a natural, Edward praised as Mason successfully captured a bishop. The boy beamed with pride. Mom says I get too competitive sometimes. Miles likes to let me win, but I can tell. These small, ordinary moments, reading with Miles, playing chess with Mason, began to heal something in Edward that he hadn't realized was broken. After years of isolation and grief, he found himself anticipating the sound of their voices, their questions, their discoveries. Each evening, Edward received updates from Dr. Harris about Catherine's condition. She's improving, but slowly, the doctor reported. The infection was quite severe. She'll need time to recover her strength. One night, as Mrs. Peterson was helping the twins prepare for bed in the guest room, Mason asked the question Edward had been dreading. Mr. Blackwood, why are you helping us so much? Edward paused, uncertain how to answer without revealing his suspicions about their parentage. Because everyone needs help sometimes, he said finally. And you boys remind me of what's important, that night. Edward sat in his study with an untouched glass of whiskey, contemplating the photograph of Jennifer Catherine from her employment file. He had missed 6 years of his son's lives, 6 birthdays, 6 Christmases, first words, first steps, moments he could never reclaim. Whatever mistakes had been made, whatever misunderstandings had occurred, Edward silently vowed to make things right, not just for the boys but for their mother too. Edward approached the closed door at the end of the hall, a door he hadn't opened in 2 years. His hand trembled slightly on the brass doorknob. Behind this door lay the nursery he and Claire had prepared with such hope, a room filled with dreams that never materialized. As he hesitated, a small voice spoke from behind him. Is this room special? Mason asked, his curious eyes fixed on Edward's hand. Edward took a deep breath. Yes. This was meant to be a child's room, my wife and I. We were going to have a baby, but it never happened. Mason nodded with surprising understanding. That's sad. Mom has a box of baby things she keeps in her closet too. She cries sometimes when she looks at it. Taking a deep breath, Edward turned the key and pushed the door open. Sunlight streamed through blue curtains illuminating the pristine white crib, the rocking chair, shelves of untouched toys and books. A fine layer of dust covered everything, despite Mrs. Peterson's regular cleaning of the rest of the house. Wow, Mason breathed. It's like a toy store. Instead of the pain Edward had expected, he felt a strange relief seeing a child, his child, in this space that had remained frozen in time for so long. Would you and Miles like to stay here while your mother gets better? He found himself asking. The guest room is nice, but this room was meant for children. Mason's eyes widened. Could we really? There's even 2 beds. Indeed, there were 2 small beds against one wall. Claire had insisted on preparing for the possibility of twins, something that had seemed like wishful thinking at the time, as Edward helped Mason and Mrs. Peterson move the twins' few belongings into the nursery. He noticed an unfamiliar box on a high shelf in the closet. Richards explained that some items from offices that had been renovated had been stored there temporarily. That evening, while the boys were having dinner with Mrs. Peterson, Edward examined the box. Among office supplies and forgotten personal items was a sealed envelope addressed to him in familiar handwriting, Jennifer Parker. His heart pounding, Edward opened the envelope. The letter inside was dated 7 years ago, just days after he had ended their relationship. Edward, I've tried to speak with you in person, but your schedule has been impossible, and now I understand why. I saw the society page photos of you, with Claire Westingham at the charity gala. I need to tell you that I'm pregnant. 8 weeks. I had planned to terminate the pregnancy, but I can't go through with it. I'll be raising this child on my own and won't ask anything of you. I'm resigning from Blackwood Properties effective immediately. Please don't contact me. I've seen the happiness in your eyes with Claire, and I won't complicate your life. If someday you wish to know your child, that door will remain open." Jennifer Edwards sank into the rocking chair, the letter trembling in his hands. She had tried to tell him. The letter had never reached him. 7 years of separation, of his sons growing up without him, of Catherine struggling alone, all because this letter had been misfiled, or a terrible suspicion formed in his mind. He pressed the intercom button for Richards. "Sir?" The butler's voice responded. "Richards, who handled my personal correspondence 7 years ago when Miss Parker worked here?" There was a pause. "Mr. Reynolds handled all sensitive correspondence, sir. He said it was to protect you from distractions." Victor, the realization, hit Edward with stunning force. His trusted friend and attorney had intercepted Jennifer's letter, had deliberately kept him from knowing about his children. Meanwhile, at Westbrook Memorial Hospital, Catherine Parker received an unexpected visitor. Victor Reynolds entered her private room with a leather portfolio and a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Parker," he said smoothly, "we have matters to discuss." After 2 weeks of intensive treatment, Catherine Parker was finally strong enough to be discharged from the hospital. Though still weak, the worst of the pneumonia had cleared, leaving her with a persistent cough and depleted energy. Edward stood awkwardly in the hospital hallway as Dr. Harris reviewed discharge instructions with Catherine. The first time he'd seen her conscious had been brief and tense, her eyes widening in recognition, then narrowing with a coldness that spoke volumes. "Mom!" The twins burst into the room, rushing to Catherine's bedside. Their faces glowed with excitement as they hugged her carefully, mindful of the IV that had just been removed. "My brave boys," Catherine whispered, her voice still raspy as she pulled them close. Her eyes glistened with tears as she breathed in their familiar scent, noticing new clothes, neatly trimmed hair, and a healthy glow that spoke of proper meals and care. Edward cleared his throat from the doorway. "I'd like to offer my home during your recovery period, Miss Parker. The doctor says you'll need several more weeks of rest to fully recuperate." Catherine's eyes met his, a storm of emotions crossing her face. Distrust, resentment, and beneath it all, exhaustion. "That's not necessary," she began. "Please, Mom," Miles interrupted. "Mr. Blackwood has a garden with a fountain and a library with all the astronomy books you can imagine. And Mrs. Peterson makes the best cookies," Mason added. "You can get stronger there." Catherine's resolve wavered, seeing the hope in her son's eyes. For years she had worked herself to exhaustion to give them even the basics. Now they had experienced comfort she could never provide, and the knowledge cut deep. "Just until you're fully recovered," Edward added quietly, "for the boys' sake." Reluctantly, Catherine agreed. The ride to the Blackwood estate was silent, tension hanging heavy in the air. The twins chattered excitedly, oblivious to the undercurrents between the adults. Mrs. Peterson had prepared a suite near the nursery where the boys were staying. As Catherine was settled into the luxurious bedroom, she felt like an intruder in a world that had been denied to her sons until now. She spent the first days keeping to her room, emerging only for meals when the boys insisted. Edward respected, her distance making himself scarce when she appeared. One evening, a week after her arrival, Catherine ventured to the library after the twins were asleep. She found Edward there, reading by the fireplace. "They have your mannerisms," she said, without preamble. Edward looked up, surprised by her presence and her words. "I've noticed for years," Catherine continued, wrapping her robe tighter around her thin frame. "Miles drums his fingers just like you do when he's thinking. Mason tilts his head the same way when he's concentrating." Edward set his book aside. "They're remarkable boys. You've done an incredible job raising them, Catherine." "How did you know?" she asked, her voice tight. "When did you figure it out?" "The moment I saw them at my door," Edward answered honestly. "The resemblance is unmistakable." Catherine's composure cracked slightly. "Then why? Why pretend for 7 years that they didn't exist? Why make me struggle alone when you had all?" "This?" Her gesture encompassed the opulent room, the mansion, the privilege that had always been beyond her reach. Edward's face registered genuine confusion. I never knew about them, Catherine. Not until they showed up at my door. She stared at him, disbelief evident in her expression. Victor Reynolds came to me 7 years ago with a check and a confidentiality agreement. He said you weren't interested in fatherhood and wanted discretion. The revelation hit Edward like a physical blow. Another piece of Victor's betrayal fell into place. Sunday morning brought tense silence to the Blackwood mansion. In the library, Edward paced as he waited for Victor to arrive, the intercepted letter clutched in his hand. When the attorney finally appeared, his customary confidence faltered at the sight of Edward's expression. "You lied to me," Edward said quietly, his voice more dangerous than if he'd shouted. "For 7 years you kept my sons from me." Victor straightened his tie. "I did what was necessary to protect you and Blackwood Properties. The timing was terrible. You had just met Claire. The Watson merger was hanging by a thread. So you intercepted Jennifer's letter." Edward slapped the paper down on his desk. "And then what? You went to her with hush money? Presented yourself as acting on my behalf?" "She was your secretary, Edward," Victor scoffed. "A nobody from the typing pool. What did you expect me to do? Let her derail everything you'd built? You were in love with Claire, about to marry into one of the most influential families in the state." Edward's voice dropped even lower. "Those boys grew up without a father because of your decisions. Their mother worked 3 jobs. They went hungry, while I lived here in empty luxury." "I made the right call," Victor insisted. "If you'd known about the pregnancy, you'd have thrown everything away out of misplaced guilt. I preserved your future." "You stole it," Edward countered. "Get out of my house, Victor. You're fired. And if you come near my family again—" "Your family?" Victor laughed incredulously. "A week ago you didn't know they existed, now they're your family?" Neither man noticed Catherine standing in the doorway, having overheard everything. She retreated silently, her world tilting on its axis. For 7 years, she'd nursed her bitterness, believing Edward had rejected his own children. She'd worked herself to exhaustion rather than use his money, determined her boys would never feel unwanted. Later that afternoon, Edward found Catherine in the garden. Her eyes were red from crying. "I heard," she said simply. "Your conversation with Victor." Edward sat beside her on the stone bench. "I never knew about the boys, Catherine. I would never have abandoned my own children." "I kept your picture," she admitted, pulling a worn photograph from her pocket. "It was the only image of their father the boys had." She handed it to Edward, himself 7 years younger, at a company picnic, smiling into the camera. "I told them you were too busy for a family," she continued. "I never said you were a bad person. I couldn't bear for them to feel rejected." Edward's vision blurred with tears. "I've missed so much." Catherine nodded, her own tears falling. "We all have." The fragile peace developing in the Blackwood mansion shattered 3 days later when the morning papers arrived. Edward's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips as he stared at the front-page headline. "Blackwood Secret Family. Millionaire's Love Child Twins Discovered." Beneath the headline were photos of Mason and Miles playing in the garden, alongside a younger image of Edward and a grainy shot of Catherine leaving the hospital. The article detailed Catherine's humble origins as Edward's former secretary, speculated about paternity claims, and quoted an anonymous source close to the family. Richards appeared at Edward's shoulder. "Sir, there are photographers at the gates." Catherine entered the dining room, her face pale. "The school called. Reporters are waiting outside the building. The boys are frightened." Edward was already reaching for his phone. "I'll send security to bring them home. This ends now." But the damage was spreading. By afternoon, Edward's phone was ringing constantly with calls from board members, investors, and social connections, all demanding explanations. Catherine, still weakened from her illness, retreated to her room with a fever. The stress had taken its toll. That evening, while Mrs. Peterson looked after the twins, Edward sat beside Catherine's bed, placing a cool compress on her forehead. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Victor is behind this. He's punishing me for firing him. Catherine's eyes fluttered open. The boys are confused. They don't understand why people are taking their picture, asking if you're their father. Edward's hand stilled. We haven't told them yet. We need to, Catherine whispered. Before someone else does. In the silence that followed, Edward noticed how the evening light softened Catherine's features, revealing glimpses of the young woman he'd known briefly 7 years ago. You know this won't last, she said suddenly, her voice tinged with old pain. The novelty will wear off. You'll tire of playing father to children who don't fit into your world. Edward met her gaze steadily. They're part of me, Catherine. The best part, perhaps. Nothing about that will change. She turned away, tears threatening. They look like you, but they're half mine too. Raised by a secretary, not a socialite. When the scandal dies down, you'll see the complications, the embarrassment to your business. No, Edward interrupted, taking her hand. I see only my sons, and they are perfect, exactly as they are. The DNA testing facility was a sterile, modern building of glass and steel. Edward had chosen it carefully, a prestigious medical laboratory with impeccable confidentiality protocols. Though he harbored no doubts about the twins' paternity, the growing media frenzy made legal confirmation necessary. This will only take a moment, the technician explained gently as she prepared to swab the inside of Mason's cheek. No needles, I promise. Mason sat bravely on the examination chair, while Miles watched with wide eyes, clutching Catherine's hand. After the simple procedure was completed for all three, the technician smiled. We'll have expedited results in 48 hours. On the drive home, Edward noticed the boys were unusually quiet in the back seat. Is everything okay? He asked, meeting their eyes in the rearview mirror. Mason, always the spokesman, finally voiced their concern. What happens if the test says we're not related? The question caught Edward off guard. The test will confirm what we already know, he assured them. But even if somehow it didn't, nothing would change how I feel about you both. 2 days later, Edward received an email with the attached results. He printed the document and studied it alone in his study, though the conclusion was exactly as expected. 99.99997% probability of paternity for both boys. That evening, he gathered Catherine and the twins in the library. The formal setting made the moment feel appropriately significant. I have something important to share with you, Edward began, his voice gentle but serious. He showed the papers first to Catherine, who nodded silently, her eyes glistening. Then, he knelt before the twins. Do you understand what DNA is? Miles nodded eagerly. It's the code inside our cells that makes us who we are. We learned about it in science class. That's right, Edward smiled. These papers show what I think we've all felt since we met. I am your biological father. The twins stared at him, processing this confirmation of something they had begun to suspect. Is that why we have the same eyes? Mason asked. Edward nodded. And the same chin, and the same way of thinking about problems. Does this mean we can call you Dad? Miles asked hesitantly, the question hanging in the air with all its weight and hope. Edward's throat tightened with emotion. I would be honored if you did. That night, after the boys were tucked into bed, Edward lingered in the hallway, overwhelmed by the day's events. Through the partially open door, he heard Miles whisper, "Good night, Dad," testing the word in the darkness. Mason echoed his brother, the simple word carrying 6 years of absence, of wondering, of longing. Edward retreated to his study, where he finally allowed himself to weep, for the years lost, for Claire who would never know these extraordinary boys, for Catherine who had carried the burden alone, and for his sons who had grown up without him. But mostly, he wept with gratitude for the unexpected gift of fatherhood that had arrived at his door on a cold evening, when he thought his life's greatest possibilities were behind him. When Richards found him hours later, staring into the darkness, with tear-stained cheeks, the butler quietly placed a hand on his employer's shoulder. a rare breach of professional distance. "Congratulations, sir," Richard said softly. "They are remarkable young men." Victor Reynolds sat in his penthouse office, nursing a glass of scotch as he surveyed the city below. The humiliation of being dismissed by Edward Blackwood after decades of loyal service burned like acid in his veins. 3 decades of protecting Edward from himself, of ensuring Blackwood properties thrived, all forgotten because of 2 children who'd appeared out of nowhere. His phone rang, a reporter hungry. "For more details about the Blackwood scandal, I'm concerned about my old friend," Victor said smoothly. "After his wife's death, he hasn't been himself. These impulsive decisions regarding children he's never met. The board is understandably worried." The foundation for his revenge was already laid. Doubt about Edward's mental state, questions about Catherine's motives, concerns from shareholders. Tomorrow he would escalate. At the Blackwood mansion, Edward reviewed documents with his legal team. Headlines about his secret family had caused Blackwood Properties stock to drop 3 points. Shareholders were demanding explanations. "Mr. B. Reynolds has filed for an emergency injunction," the head lawyer explained. "He's claiming to represent concerned shareholders, questioning your competency to run the company while experiencing what he calls psychological distress following prolonged grief." Edward's jaw tightened. "He's using Claire's death against me?" "There's more," the lawyer continued hesitantly. "He's petitioning the court to prevent you from legally recognizing the twins until a full psychological evaluation is completed. He's gathered affidavits from former employees claiming you were aware of Ms. Parker's pregnancy 7 years ago." "That's a lie," Edward growled. "We know, sir. But fighting this publicly could get messy. Mr. Reynolds is suggesting a settlement. You step down temporarily from daily operations, postpone any legal recognition of the children, and the shareholders will withdraw their concerns." Edward stood abruptly. "I will not use my sons as bargaining chips. Prepare whatever counterfilings are necessary." Later that evening, the tension in the house was palpable. Catherine had overheard part of the legal discussions, and worry lined her face as she helped the twins with homework at the kitchen table. "Is this going to cause problems for your business?" she asked quietly when the boys went upstairs. "Victor is trying to pressure me," Edward admitted. "Using the company, using Claire's memory. Because of us," Catherine stated flatly. "We've brought chaos into your life." "No," Edward insisted. "Victor's betrayal did this, not you or the boys." Upstairs, Mason and Miles weren't asleep as their parents believed. They sat on the window seat in their room whispering. "They're fighting because of us," Mason said worriedly. "Did you hear what that lawyer said? They might take Dad's company away. And they're saying mean things about Mom in the news," Miles added. "Jenna at school showed me a story on her phone. It said Mom was trying to get Dad's money." The twins fell silent as they heard raised voices from downstairs. Unfamiliar voices of lawyers discussing strategy, debating the boys' future as if they were assets to be divided. "We're just causing problems," Mason decided, his young face set with determination. "Remember what Mom always says? Parkers solve problems, not make them." Miles nodded solemnly. "What should we do?" An hour later, Edward knocked on the boys' door to say goodnight and found the room empty. On the pillow lay a note in Mason's careful handwriting. "We don't want to be problem for anyone. Don't worry about us. We went home." "They couldn't have gone far," Edward said, struggling to keep panic from his voice as he scanned the boys' room for clues. The note crumpled in his hand. "They don't have money for a bus or taxi." Catherine was already pulling on her coat. "They've gone back to our apartment. They know the way. They've been walking these neighborhoods their whole lives." The frantic search began with Edward's driver rushing them to Catherine's apartment building. The small unit was dark and empty, dust gathering on the few remaining furnishings. Where else might they go? Edward asked, desperation evident in his voice. Catherine's eyes widened with sudden realization. "The cemetery. My mother's buried there. The boys visit her grave when they're upset." 3 days of searching followed. Police reports filed. Security teams scouring the city. Edward's photo of the twins appearing on local news. Catherine barely slept, her health declining again with the stress. Edward canceled all business obligations, his only focus finding his sons. On the third morning, as exhaustion and fear threatened to overwhelm them both, the mansion's doorbell rang. Richards opened the door to find a petite woman in her 30s, with kind eyes and a determined expression. Beside her stood Mason and Miles, tired but unharmed. "Elizabeth," Catherine rushed forward, gathering the twins in her arms. "I found them at your mother's grave," Elizabeth explained. "They've been staying with me, but I only just saw the news reports." Elizabeth Andrews had been Jennifer's assistant years ago and remained Catherine's friend through the difficult years that followed. As they settled in the library, Edward noticed Elizabeth watching him with careful assessment. "There's something else you should know," she said finally, opening her handbag to remove a sealed envelope. "I've kept these for 7 years, hoping they might be needed someday." Inside were emails between Victor and the HR department regarding Jennifer's resignation, a copy of the original letter Jennifer had sent Edward about her pregnancy, and most damning, a recording of Victor pressuring Jennifer to leave town with a settlement. "He threatened to fabricate misconduct charges against you if Jennifer didn't disappear," Elizabeth explained. "I was copying files that day and heard everything. Jennifer refused his money but agreed to leave to protect your reputation." Catherine and Edward exchanged shocked glances, finally understanding the full extent of Victor's manipulation, how thoroughly he had orchestrated their separation and the years of pain that followed. The twins, exhausted from their ordeal, had fallen asleep against Catherine's shoulders. Looking at their peaceful faces, Edward and Catherine shared a moment of perfect unity, a silent vow that no one would ever separate their family again. The evidence provided by Elizabeth changed everything. Edward's attorneys moved swiftly, filing countercharges against Victor Reynolds for fraud, obstruction, and corporate malfeasance. The recording of Victor pressuring Jennifer to leave town was particularly damning, his voice clear as he threatened to fabricate misconduct accusations against Edward if she didn't disappear. "The board needs to see this immediately," Edward's lead attorney advised. "Reynolds' entire case hinges on painting you as unstable and Ms. Parker as an opportunist. This proves the opposite." Within days, Victor's carefully constructed narrative crumbled. The emergency board meeting that he had called to question Edward's leadership instead became his own undoing. As evidence of his years of deception was presented, longtime allies distanced themselves. The shareholder lawsuit was withdrawn with formal apologies. Meanwhile, the press that had eagerly published scandalous speculation now pursued a different angle. The heartwarming reunion of a father with the sons he never knew existed, cruelly separated by a manipulative attorney's schemes. Public sentiment shifted practically overnight. "They're calling it the story of the year," Catherine remarked, showing Edward the newspaper headline. "Blackwood family reunited. Truth triumphs over deception." For the twins, the rapid developments were both exciting and confusing. One morning, Mason found Edward in his study reviewing legal documents. "What happens to us now?" he asked, his young face serious. "When all this is over?" Edward set the papers aside. "What do you mean, son?" Mason fidgeted with the sleeve of his sweater. "At school, Tommy said you'd get tired of playing dad and send us back to our old apartment." Edward knelt to meet his son at eye level. "Mason, I'm not playing anything. I am your father. Not just because a DNA test says so, but because I love you and Miles more than anything in this world. Nothing will ever change that." The boy's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Promise?" "I promise." Edward's voice was firm with conviction. "In fact, I have something important to show you and Miles." Later that afternoon, the entire family sat before a judge in his chambers, a private, dignified setting for a momentous occasion. With Catherine's full support, Edward legally recognized Mason and Miles as his sons. The judge presented the boys with new birth certificates, officially changing their names to Mason Parker Blackwood and Miles Parker Blackwood. "We kept Parker as your middle names," Catherine explained gently, "because that's part of who you are too." As they left the courthouse, reporters and photographers lined the steps. Edward placed a protective hand on each boy's shoulder, while Catherine walked beside them. The cameras captured not a scandal, but a family, unconventional perhaps, but undeniably real, stepping into the sunlight together. In the car heading home, Miles studied his new birth certificate with wonder. "Does this mean we're really Blackwoods now?" he asked. "You've always been Blackwoods," Edward answered. "The papers just make official what was always true." Catherine watched her sons' faces, seeing in them a security and belonging she had fought to give them all their lives. For years, she had carried the burden alone, believing Edward had rejected them. Now, seeing the gentle way he guided the boys, the patience with which he answered their endless questions, she finally allowed herself to trust that this extraordinary turn in their lives was not temporary, but the beginning of something lasting. 1 year had passed since the courthouse steps, a year of adjustment, healing, and growth. The Blackwood mansion no longer resembled the silent mausoleum it had once been. Family photos lined the hallways, children's artwork adorned the refrigerator, and the sounds of laughter regularly echoed through rooms that had known only silence for too long. Catherine lived in the guest cottage on the property, close enough to be present in her sons' daily lives, but with enough distance to maintain her independence. She had found her own path forward, heading the Blackwood Family Connection Foundation, which Edward had established to support families separated by deception or circumstance. On a crisp autumn evening, Edward adjusted Miles's tie as they prepared for the boys' school talent show. "Nervous?" Edward asked, noticing his son's fidgeting hands. Miles nodded. "A little. What if I forget the words to my poem?" "Then you'll find new ones," Edward assured him. "That's what writers do." In the auditorium, Edward and Catherine sat side by side, not as a couple, but as partners united by their shared love for their sons. The relationship between them had evolved into something neither could have imagined a year ago, a deep respect and genuine friendship born from their commitment to giving Mason and Miles the family stability they deserved. Mason performed first, his fingers moving confidently across the piano keys as he played the classical piece he and Edward had practiced for weeks. The musical talent he had inherited from his father had blossomed with proper instruction, and the pride on Edward's face as he watched was unmistakable. When Miles took the stage next, his initial nervousness melted away as he began to recite the poem he had written. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, but facing what terrifies you most, like knocking on a door when you're hungry, or opening your heart when it's been closed. Courage is building a family from broken pieces and finding home in unexpected places." Catherine reached for Edward's hand as tears filled her eyes. So much had changed in a year. The twins no longer carried the weight of adult worries on their small shoulders, no longer went to bed hungry or cold. They were simply boys now, free to be children with the security of knowing they were deeply loved. After the performance, as they greeted friends and neighbors who had once whispered about the scandal but now embraced the family without reservation, Mason tugged on Edward's sleeve. "Dad, could we go somewhere special tomorrow?" "Of course," Edward replied. "Where would you like to go?" "To the cemetery," Miles explained. "We want to bring flowers for Claire." Edward's breath caught. "For Claire? Why?" Mason's eyes, so like Edward's own, held wisdom beyond his years. "Because without her teaching you how to love, you might never have found us." That night, as Edward walked through the mansion after tucking the boys into bed, he passed the photograph of Claire on his desk. "They would have loved you," he whispered. "And you would have loved them." The empty spaces in Edward Blackwood's life, spaces that wealth and success could never fill, had finally found their purpose. In the most unexpected way, through pain and separation and eventual healing, he had found the family he had always longed for.